Hello, I'm Aziz Haniffa, co-founder and executive editor of Decimax and former executive editor of India Abroad. Today, it's our pleasure to welcome eminent glaciologist Professor Syed Iqbal Hasnain, whose interests range far beyond the climate and environment and into politics and religion. And he has recently authored Fault Lines in the Faith, where he describes how events of 1979 that began with the Iranian Revolution and brought the Ayatollah Imam Khomeini into power and established an enduring theocracy, shaped the Islamic world. Let me also mention that Professor Hasnain is a Padma Shri awardee, which is one of India's highest civilian awards. Also with us today is Dr. Brian Grimm, founding president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation and global chair of Dare to Overcome, a corporate diversity initiative that promotes mutual respect and engagement among differing groups in the workplace. To start things off, Dr. Hasnain, let me ask you how you, as a glaciologist by training and background, came to write a book on geopolitics and religion. What was the rationale for it, and what is its message?
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank American Bazaar and its founder, Mr. Asif Ismail, and Aziz Hanifa, the veteran journalist from America. He has been the founder editor of India Abroad, and Mr. Grin, my friend Grin, Brian Grin. So let me answer your question that why I was inspired to write this book. It goes back in 94. I was the senior fellow at the University of Manchester in England doing for glacier, alpine glacier work. And at that time, the University of Manchester is traditionally full of the South Asian and the Middle Eastern students. There's a lot of communities there. And when I used to go to the Friday prayers, I found out that that there's a lot of anger in the youths, and they were talking about the jihad. They were talking about taking the revenge from the Western society, though they were living in the Western societies and they were born and brought up there. But they have various reasons to go against them, what is happening in Middle East, and they thought that is the very schemes of the Zionism and the Western, the Americans and the Britishers to demean the Muslim cultures and all that. So there was a lot of anger that, and later on I moved to US and I saw in many universities the Islamic societies and the Islamic Sunday school and cultures, and I saw all over them there is a lot of anger, and that is a kind of a special creed of Islam that what we call the Salafism and Wahhabism is making inroads in that, and they were started hating other faiths. Similarly, the glacier. Uh, my studies in glaciology gave me a lot of opportunity to travel, whether I went to Hokkaido or Seoul or Alaska or Cape Town, anywhere I went there, I visited the local mosque and saw what is going on. So that is it was in the back of my mind. And when I retired in 2006, uh, and then I joined a think uh, uh, mm, a center here, a Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., to work on the shared water resources. And that the whole project was funded by a State Department to study about the shared water resources between China, India, and Pakistan, and that has to do with the glacier and glacier melts. So at that time, I had an opportunity of visiting Carnegie and other think tanks here. They were discussing the Middle East, and that was in 2009, 10, 11. I was here in the United States, and think tanks were really debating about the what is going on in the Middle East. So I got a little background about that, and then when I went back to Delhi, I started writing the manuscript, and I'm thankful to the Rupa publication. They published my book in 2023 in November, but the manuscript was given to them before the COVID and it was little delayed. And also thankful to my editors from Kerala, Mr. Jabir and Aditi Malhotra from here. They have done amazing work in editing the book. So that is where this book has come out, and I'm really happy and I'm overwhelmed by the success of this book. A lot of West Asian experts are like the analysis because this is the first time the 79 events were made the basis of the story of writing the whole Islamism and how it is spread or the political is spread across the world. And that is where this book is now.
And before I get to Dr. Grimm, what was it you who named the book Fault Lines in the Faith, or was it the publisher who made that title? And like I asked you, what is your message that you're trying to get out? Is there an outcome you're hoping?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question, Aziz. The publishers discussed with me various titles, and this is the one title which we stuck it. And the reason why we stuck it, there are two fault lines in the Islam. One is the Shia Sunni Islam, which is a two competing part of the Islam, and that happened long back in 680. The division came about, and another thing is about the uh, uh, what you can say the Salafism, Wahhabism against the Sufi Islam, Sufi tradition, which is the holistic traditions, which is more tolerant traditions, and that amplified after 79. That was there earlier also, because Ibn Taymiyyah, if you go back into the 14th century, and Abdul Wahhab in the 18th century, they have roots in the past, but that is amplification was took place after 79 when they were talking about the Wahhabism, talking about the Shiaism against Sufism, and that is where another fault line has emerged. So these are the two major fault lines in Islam, which was in the back of our mind, and the whole narrative, if you see from the 79, happened because of the sectarian fault lines, and these fault lines are also played a big part. And you have seen many mazars in Pakistan and other places were blasted out by the Wahhabi groups.
Dr. Grimm, you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think that it's wonderful that Professor Hasnain has written this book, so congratulations. It's a tour de force of the really history of the Islamic world from 1979 and even going back a bit. But I found that sweeping history is great. And the thing that I found most valuable is this emphasis on Sufi Islam. And part of that is I've lived and worked in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, but I also worked in Soviet Central Asia and Northwest China. And my very first experiences with Islam were in Southeast China, in the first one of the first ports where Islam came into China almost soon after the time of Muhammad. Persian traders came and set up one of the first mosques in a place called Quanzhou. And when I went there in 1982, nobody had even thought that religion survived the Cultural Revolution in China, but it not only survived, but thrived in many ways. And so the Islam I first encountered there had come by sea, not across what I would have imagined, sort of from the Silk Road, but Christianity entered China through the Silk Road. So then when I worked in Western China, again, they were Sunnis, and there was a Wahhabi influence during the communist period. So as the communists spread to Western China, they encountered both a very Sufi form of Islam, but also one that had some Wahhabi influences on the theology. And what I saw mostly in Central Asia was this Sufi practice. And, it was very different kind of Islam than I encountered when I went to Saudi Arabia back in the 1990s. And so I think that emphasis on bringing out this rich tradition and very diverse tradition of Sufi Islam is excellent, because in my encounter in the Muslim world is of its diversity. And sometimes, there's a little pushback against that idea, because in Islam, there's one God, there's one belief. But even within oneness, there's diversity, there's a great diversity of experience and traditions. So I think that, as someone who's also studied the Islamic sort of fundamentalism, this radicalization that's come out both in Europe, the US, and then across the Middle East. A lot of that, I think the book rightly points out, is coming out of people who weren't really often not well versed in Islam. So I think that's another important point, that a lot of people were pulled into radicalization through nationalism or through not being able to have a job. And the last thing I'll mention is also a joint connection in Manchester. So we did my foundation, Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, did an interfaith empowerment project in Manchester, working with Muslims, Christians, Jews, even some Buddhists and others, helping youth share their experiences of trying to find jobs and how their faith interacted with that. And so I think, part of, that radicalization came because people didn't see opportunities. So again, the book touches on many of these themes, and I think it's really, for many people, will be eye-opening, an eye-opening understanding of Islam and the forces that are creating what we see today.
Professor Hasnain, picking up on what Dr. Grimm spoke about Sufism, which you seem to recommend as an antidote and the way forward. A lot of conservative Muslims consider Sufism as un-Islamic. How do you explain that? How do you offer Sufism as an antidote to this radicalization, or the sort of what some people may describe as a rabid political Islam or militant Islam? How do you sort of compartmentalize or try to straddle the fact that a lot of Muslims, conservative Muslims, consider Sufism as un-Islamic?
Yeah, thank you, Aziz. So you have to go back into the history, look at that the golden period of the Islam, which is spread from 9th century to 13th century, and then there is a Mongol invasion on Baghdad, and everything was destroyed, and the whole Qutb Khanas and the books and were put up into the river, and it was a big disaster for the Muslim community. So there was a scholar known as Ibn Taymiyyah. He was a Yemeni scholar or Syrian scholar, and he was so much impacted by, he was 13th and 14th century, his time frame was there, and he wrote that what happened and what bad thing happened to these Muslims is because they lost the faith. They are not they are not on the Islamic faith, which was practiced during the first three Khalifas' time, and that's why he says self. Self means the early period of Islam, and that's what he wrote many books about those things. And then he said that between one individual and God, there is no one, and that's why he was believer of the Hanbali sect of Islam, because as you know, there are four: Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali. So he was the Hanbali scholar, and he further extended that boundaries, and they were against the Shiaism and Sufism, that kind of a thing, which Sufism was growing at that time, and afterwards the followers of Mr. Ibn Taymiyyah also destroyed the first, the original tomb of Prophet Muhammad, And he say, okay, we should not pay obeisance to the Prophet, but he is not God. God is different, and he believes in Hadith and all that. So, and they reinterpreted Hadith and the Quran. And then at that time, 14th century, the Ottomans has come back. Ottomans were ruling the whole Arabian Peninsula, and they were very upset about those things. And then they executed so many of his followers and all that. So everything was gone down at that time. Until the 18th century, another scholar was born, is known as Abdul Wahab. He further pushed the boundaries of the Salafism, and then he was from the Dirya oasis, which is the home of Ibn Saud also. Ibn Saud was very ambitious, uh, in charge of that oasis known as the Dirya oasis, and he wanted to capture the Hijaz area because it's a money spinner. Big money was coming at that time. So Mr. Abdul Wahab met. He was fighting with Ottomans, and Ottomans very powerful, and of course he was not getting any success against Ottomans. So then he suggested to them that why don't you put up little religion in your fight, and instead of simply then the people in the initial period, the people opposed from that settlement and other settlement, but later on he convinced them, okay, this is the way we should reinterpret the Islam, or rebooted the Islam at that time. And in 1744, the Ibn Saud and Abdul Wahab an agreement that we will push up that kind of a creed of Islam, which is now known as Wahhabism, but it is the further extension of Salafism, which was originated 1400 years back, or 400 years back at that time in 14th century. So that is the background of this thing. That then everything was quiet, and many scholars, whether in the Indian subcontinent, Shah Waliullah, and so many people, started believing that kind of a creed of Islam, that is a kind of a reinvention, or what you call a new concept or new interpretation of the Islam was given by them. But everything was under wrap. And if you come back, fast track it, and come back to 79, before 79, in 1400 years history of Islam never had any problem with any culture, any religion. They were very tolerant, and because they were following the Sufi tradition. Sufism, is that simply it's not that it is religious, but it is a kind of a putting up a spirituality, or your contact with the God, that you got as a fuf, what we call it. And it is not, but it is practiced in Hanafi, is practiced in Maliki, is practiced in that, but not in Hanbali. So that is what the differences is, or crop up at that time. And then before 79, the women are driving cars. There were theaters even in Saudi Arabia and all that. So the whole thing, then my book starts from the 79, how the events of 79 is so important. Then the Iranian revolution took place in the early 79. And that revolution is the first revolution in the entire Middle East, which is uprising from the bottom up. It was earlier, if you see in Egypt, in Syria, and Iraq and other things, the army is taking and removing the monarchy. But here the monarchy was thrown out by the common people. There was uprising. And that uprising was a little, have a religious content in it, and that is, which is upset the Sunni Islam, the followers of the Wahhabism, which were lying dormant at that time. And then they seized the Kaaba by the end of 79, and then threatened to overthrow the royal family. And then it's all there in my book, that how they call the French special guards, and they have negotiated. And then Mr. Otabi, who was the leader of that, he had a connection with Ikhwan, or the Muslim Brotherhood, and then he was he was executed by them. But the clergy which is behind that was greatly benefited, and then the King Khalid has an agreement. Okay, you can pursue your faith, you can further the Wahhabism, which was their main creed of Islam in Saudi, and then he made the religious police and other things, and everybody knows it what has happened, and the girls and the ladies cannot go without a male escorts, and everybody has to cover up every inch of the body, and all kind of a thing. And the Taliban is the worst case, where the girls cannot be go to the school, and everything is just happening. So that was the beginning of this thing, and the whole Islamic world were divided between two, and they very aggressively the Saudi money, because they made a Muslim World League, is one of the NGOs which is funded all the mosques globally, and the Islamic centers, and they had annual budget is about billions of dollars. The first grant the government gave, the royal family gave them $2 billion. They had flushing in money, and that's why they were putting up mosques, constructing mosques. They interpreted the hadith, they interpreted the Quran, having a training, and then the entire Muslim world was changed by them, and they were overwhelmed. The entire Muslim world overwhelmed, and for the poor countries like India, Indonesia, and all that, they were putting up, setting up madrasas. And in Pakistan, you have seen that entire madrasa system was having that kind of a curriculum, which is later on shaped into the Taliban, and they are still governing the Afghanistan.
Professor Hasnain, the historical fault line you mentioned was the split where it led to the Sunnis and the Shias. But you also speak about, and you did mention the contemporary fault line in 1979, which
Yeah.
came with the Iranian Revolution and, of course, the advent of Imam Khomeini. And, of course, then there was the erstwhile Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Uh, the United States policy has also, one can argue, has led to these fault lines. After all, in fact, Farid Zakaria did a very terrific documentary about why Iran hates the United States. It goes back to the 1953 coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh when he was trying to nationalize the oil companies. It was the CIA and the British intelligence that got rid of Mossadegh. And then, of course, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where initially Osama bin Laden and others were part of the Mujahideen, who were provided with Stinger missiles, etc., to fight off the Soviet Union. And then the whole world, in a sense, turned topsy-turvy with the US and the advent of the Taliban and the Mujahideen, etc. So isn't the US foreign policy part and parcel of these fault lines, the contemporary fault lines in Islam that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, thank you. You raised a very pertinent question. And the third point, which is in my book in 79, it happened in October or November, the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. So when the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan took place, and that's what the U.S. security agencies have thought, that it may be that they are trying to get a hot water or warm water port, and they will threaten to the oil resources of the Middle East. So then Mr. President Reagan was the president of America at that time, and then his team has suggested to him, why don't we arm those mujahideen who are fighting against the Soviet invasion, because it was a regular kind of some people have invaded the country, or some Soviet Union invaded, so there was a local war is going on against the invasion. So they turned into a jihadi war, and they gave about, in the initial period, I've written in a very detail in my book, $8 million, and shoulder fired missiles was known as a Stinger missile, And then they outsourced their leadership, local leadership, to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, their best friend at that time. And they say, okay, you execute it to the ground, and we'll give you the financial support. And that really was the turning point in the globalization of jihad. Then after 89, when the Soviet Union has withdrawn from Afghanistan, and so the Americans have a very characteristic, or I don't know how, they are very smart people, but say, okay, the job is accomplished and we are also going back, and they have withdrawn from that. And then what happened? Then the whole jihadis were stranded there. And first they were fighting each other, the Mujahideen. Then the Pakistan has got, Mrs. Bhutto was the prime minister, and he has some defense minister, has got a great idea. Why don't we have so many Afghanis in our madrasas? Why don't we push them? And then with the American money was there and the Saudi support was there, and they pushed them as a Taliban, and the Taliban took over. And then Mr. Osama bin Laden, who was not there, he has gone back to Sudan or some other places, because that is another story, why Osama bin Laden was upset, because in between, when the Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, then the American forces came, and he was very angry why the Saudi Arabia allowed these infidels to be, the Americans to have the forces stationed in Saudi area, and they're fighting the fellow Arabs, all sort of things. So that is there in my book. It is given in very much detail. And that is why he was upset. Then he was in Sudan. And then when the Taliban government of Mullah Umar was formed, he has come back and he's invited that. And then 9/11 happened and all those things happened. And it is the terrorism, or what you call the extremism, is globalized. And that is the same period, 94, 95, 90s, when the internet has also come up. And that also helped in globalization, because they're putting up all the websites. And another factor which I put in my book, say those from my generation of people who have migrated to the Western countries for looking for a better job opportunities, they have a children. But because of a patriarchy, we have a very strong patriarchal mindset. So we never allowed our sons and daughters to participate in the weekend schools and weekend parties and all that. So they were stuck back at the home, and they have no other alternative, just simply to watching, because the parents are watching the Indian Pakistani dramas or Indian films, and they are hooking up with the internet and going back to the Al Qaeda kind of a website, and they are radicalized, and a lot of them have changed their opinion, and they were and we have seen that in many US campuses, the boys became very aggressive, and then some of them died. I know one of my family's young boy was found dead in the hostel because he was very aggressive about the Islamism kind of a thing, which was so much spreading at that. And same thing happened in Europe also, in France, in England, and other countries, in Belgium, where a lot of a Muslim community has migrated. So there is a chapter on the migration of the Muslims also. I trace the history when the migration started, and after 60s, what happened. So it is a combination of factors which pushed them to the radicalization. And later on, another thing which has happened, that as a consequences of this, then the US started bombing Afghanistan. That, say, Mr. Zarqawi, for example, who moved to Iraq, and in 2007, Americans invaded Iraq on a pretext that, okay, they have a
nuclear weapons,
mass destruction or whatever, the bombs and or nuclear bombs. And later on, even they regretted it, because the chief of the army staff of America, who was claiming in the say that, okay, it was a bad thing, it was never there, that they have bombs and nuclear bombs and things like that. But they happened. and all these things. The American role was very negative role, and first they pushed this Wahhabism, and they were supporting it, jihadism, because jihad is the built-in architecture of Wahhabism. It is a part of that. And I myself experienced when I was at the University of Manchester, after Juma prayer, there used to be a paper spread that who want to go to jihad or want to learn about jihad. And then once a meeting I attended, it was a training program, 2 weeks training program in Medina, and all your travel and your lodging will be paid. I said, okay, I'm going to the glacier, but I can't go there. So, but I wanted to know more about it. So that is my full real-time experience, how the things were going on at that time. And that later on that I could do a better job of writing from the inside story of the whole 79, how they shaped the Islamic world.
Dr. Grimm, how will a book like Professor Hasnain, sort of in a world which is now all full of social media and TikTok and Facebook and everything else, and how can you bring in the sort of antidote that he proposes of a kind of spirituality to counter the radicalism, the militancy that is prevalent in a whole lot of countries, particularly in South Asia, but also in the Middle East, and the Iranian connection? How can a book like Professor Hasnain's, working with the kind of foundation you have and your program, your initiative of Dare to Overcome, alleviate this? Or is it a problem where they always say in real politics, there aren't permanent friends or permanent enemies. There are only permanent interests. And the US has been a player in that kind of cliche because on one hand, it promoted the conservative brand of Islam, which has now, in a sense, come back to bite them and bite the whole world.
Well, that's a lot of big questions there. I think one of the great things about his book is that it promotes discussion and promotes discussions that weren't happening before the book. So just like our discussion today. And I have seen over and over the possibility there is when people are willing to respect each other's belief and stand up for the other person's right to believe and behave according to their beliefs without having to agree with each other. So that's something that we call covenantal pluralism. Covenant means an agreement to the idea that pluralism, where we can have this rich society where different viewpoints compete with each other to come up with the best ideas. And I think that's where the hope is. I think that's why we write books. I've written books, and we write books so that we can get ideas out there so that people can engage with them. It's not that any book or any scholar has all the answers, of course not. But we can start asking questions, putting information out, putting facts out. And I think one of the unique features of Sufism is its pluralistic nature. That it's not so hierarchical, where everything has to be decided by somebody at the top, or even pass muster theologically. It comes out of people's experience, and then having that ability to talk about it. So this Dare to Overcome initiative we have, which is global, but we also have a great program in India that Professor Hasnain has helped us with some good connections. And one of the great performances we had at our event, which brings business people together from all different types of companies, but to talk about this covenantal pluralism idea, how it helps business. So in business, if you have only one kind of person, you're going to only think in one kind of way, and then you can't reach all the markets and you can't serve everyone. But if you have a diverse workforce, then all those different ideas can work together. And so we bring businesses together to talk about that. One of the performances we had was Sonam Kalra. She has a group called the Sufi Gospel Project. So right there you've got, and they're Hindus, you've got Hindu performers performing Sufi music and gospel music, which is, Christian music. And they've brought those together in a way where they're letting music have a dialogue. And so, and I was just recently in India at the Golden Temple, the Sikh temple, and, the stories of the interaction between, Sufis and Sikhs as part of their even heritage in that region. So there's something in the Sufi experience, the Sufi model, that encourages people of different backgrounds to engage with one another without giving up. I don't have, I'm Catholic. I don't have to become a Sufi or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Hindu in order to appreciate what these other backgrounds provide. And so I think that's, it's with a book that gives the opportunity to start talking about these ideas that are very hopeful. I think there's great hope in the idea that spirituality has this power to bring people together. And one of the greatest religious movements in Western countries today is this idea of I'm spiritual but not religious. So a lot of the young people, they're coming and they're saying, well, I don't really like all these certain things attached to religion, but I still have this hunger for deeper meaning and connecting with God. So I think those kind of discussions open people's minds up to ideas that aren't so trapped into a narrow understanding. And I'll make one more comment before yielding back. It's just on the United States, and there's a growing movement among policymakers to understand some of these dynamics, to realize that peace is possible only when you have this protections, when we stand up for each other's right to have our own beliefs and live accordingly. So that produces a rich and peaceful society. So policymakers understand this connection. One of the challenges, though, in the American political system is we have elections every 2 years, and everybody for the members of the House of Representatives, and so it's hard to keep a consistent policy going when they're having to run for re-election, then president every 4 years, Senate every 6 years. So the American system loses some of those well thought through plans. It's just like, when the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan, America moves on to the next thing because, we've got a new election, new leaders, and instead of thinking through things strategically and in the long term. So, hopefully that's one thing that civil society provides and thinkers provide and books provide, is helping policymakers who have to get reelected every 2 years have some consistent thinking and informed policy.
Professor Hasnain, in terms of final thoughts, Dr. Grimm spoke about the hopefulness, the optimism, the spirituality that can perhaps be like a balm on what has been happening with conflicts raging all over the world. But in today's world, and with what's happening in Gaza between the Israelis and the Palestinians, is there any hope for such optimism or hopefulness? Or are there going to be many, many more fault lines? Because one can argue that the radicalism, the extremism, and the militancy will only continue to foment itself even more.
Yeah, what's happening in Gaza, or this is a fight between the Palestinian Hamas, which is a group. It is also have a
Thank you very much, Professor Hasnain, and thank you very much, Dr.
Yeah.
Grimm. It has been a
Thank you,
delightful
Aziz. Thank you for anchoring this important discussion, because I just show in the end my book, and
Please,
the
please hold it up a little more. Yes,
and
yeah.
the real taste of the pie is in eating it. So the people
Yes,
read it, then
yes.
it will be good and they will be benefited, because the USP of this book is about the 79 event. Most of the people written about those things, but not blending them and how it is really happened. And even Farid Zakaria, you mentioned it, he also said that Islam for 1400 years before 79 were at peace with the Western culture. But what happened in the 79, and that's why the Professor Nasser Arif, who wrote the foreword of this book, he's an Egyptian and professor in the University of Cairo. He said more and more research is required on this event and how it is spread out, and what is the ultimate goal of it and possible solution. But I see the revival of Sufism is one of the best solution of it, because if you see in Indian subcontinent, we had a bhakti movement of the Hinduism, and it is very close to Sufism, the spirituality, and I mean in Buddhism or in other religions also, and the Christianity and all that. So spirituality, that Sufism is the only way forward for ending these kind of a conflict within the faith.
Thank you very much
Thank you
again,
very
and
much.
wish you all the very best, Professor Hasnain, and
Thank
all
you.
power to your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a great
Thank
topic.
you.